am Calliope Tazanna, and I am 31 years old. Last weekend, I stood in the center of a sprawling marble courtyard in Connecticut, surrounded by 150 guests wearing designer silk and tailored linen. It was my baby shower. The caterers were pouring vintage champagne, a string quartet played softly near the manicured hedges, and my father, Richard, decided it was the perfect moment to put me in my place. He tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon, stepping up to the microphone with that practiced, arrogant smile he reserved for his real estate investors. The courtyard quieted down. He looked right at me. I was 7 months pregnant, standing alone by the gift table. "We are all eager to see the next generation of the Tazanna Empire," he announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "But let me make one family rule clear today. If this baby is a girl, do not expect an inheritance from me. The Tazanna wealth flows to male heirs. Men build and protect the legacy. Women just marry into someone else's." The silence that fell over the courtyard was suffocating. I watched the country club wives lower their eyes, exchanging pathetic, pitying glances. I heard the ice clink in someone's glass 3 tables away. My older brother Julian stood behind my father, smirking and checking his Rolex. My father stood there on the terrace, chest puffed out, waiting for me to shrink. He expected me to cry, to lower my head, to absorb the humiliation the way I had been trained to do my entire life. I did not flinch. I took a sip of my sparkling water, smiled, and gave a sharp nod to the catering director standing by the balcony. A giant balloon suspended above the courtyard burst open with a loud pop. A thick rain of bright pink confetti drifted down over the horrified crowd. Twin girls. My father's smug smile froze on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I reached into my leather bag first. I pulled out a crisp, notarized legal document and held it up so the afternoon sun caught the thick gold seal. "They do not need your money, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, carrying across the courtyard without a microphone. "Because before Grandfather Harrison died, he bypassed you. He set up an irrevocable $5 million trust fund reserved exclusively for the female descendants of this bloodline. You get nothing." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. I watched my father drop his champagne flute, the crystal shattering across the stone floor. Before I explain exactly how my father's kingdom crumbled right there on the patio, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. But only do it if this story truly resonates with you. Drop a comment letting me know your age, where you are listening from, and what local time it is right now. Now, let me take you back to a time long before the confetti and the secret trust funds. Let me take you back 20 years, to the day I realized my childhood home was a financial prison, and the day my brother was handed the keys to an empire he did not deserve. Growing up in the Tazanna household meant memorizing your exact place in a rigid, unspoken hierarchy. Our home in Greenwich was a sprawling colonial estate, featuring dark mahogany floors, vaulted ceilings, and a dining room table that felt more like a corporate boardroom. At the head of that table sat my father, Richard. To his immediate right sat Julian, my older brother by 3 years. I was usually seated at the far end, near the kitchen doors, positioned more like a spectator than a participant in my own family. My father treated our home as a shrine to his own ego and a training ground for his chosen successor. Julian was groomed for the executive suite from the moment he could walk. The problem was, Julian possessed all the arrogance of a future CEO, but none of the actual intellect. He coasted through elite private schools on the strength of my father's generous donations, failing basic economics classes while test driving the imported sports cars my father bought him as rewards for simply existing. I took a different path. I understood early on that my survival required perfection. I kept my head down, poured myself into my textbooks, and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance. I spent my weekends building predictive market models, while Julian spent his out on Long Island Sound, crashing my father's yacht into the docks. When my graduation day arrived, my father showed up 20 minutes late, took one photo with me for his country club friends to see, and then spent the rest of the afternoon discussing commercial zoning permits with Julian. My framed diploma ended up in a downstairs guest bathroom. Julian's amateur golf trophies occupied the center of the living room mantel. The disparity was painful, but I tolerated it because I had a plan. I had been accepted into an Ivy League master's program. My tuition was supposed to be covered by a $50,000 education fund my late grandmother had set up for me years prior. It was my ticket out of Connecticut, my bridge to independence. I just needed to pay the enrollment deposit by the end of August. Then came the phone call in the middle of a rainy Tuesday night. I woke up to the sound of hushed, panicked voices echoing from my father's study. I crept down the hallway and peered through the cracked oak door. Julian was slumped on a leather sofa, his designer shirt torn, smelling heavily of gin and terrible decisions. My father was pacing the floor, barking orders at his crisis management lawyer on speakerphone. Julian had wrapped his Porsche around a brick retaining wall in a wealthy subdivision. He had walked away with a scratched forehead, but he had caused significant property damage and injured a passenger in another vehicle. The other family was preparing to press charges and drag the Tazanna name through the local press. My father did not yell at Julian. Instead, he poured his son a glass of water and assured him everything would be handled. 2 days later, I logged into my student banking portal to wire my tuition deposit. The screen loaded, displaying a balance of 0. My heart hammered against my ribs. I refreshed the page 3 times, assuming there was a glitch in the banking software. The ledger showed a single authorized wire transfer executed that very morning, draining the entire $50,000. The destination account belonged to my father's legal firm. I marched straight into my father's home office. He was sitting behind his desk reviewing a stack of blueprints, wearing his reading glasses and a perfectly tailored suit. He did not even look up when I slammed my laptop onto his desk. "Where is my tuition money?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He removed his glasses slowly, folding them with practiced deliberation. "Keep your voice down, Calliope," he said. "We had a family emergency." Julia's legal settlement required immediate liquid capital to ensure the injured party signed a non-disclosure agreement. "I repurposed your academic fund." "You stole it," I shot back, the betrayal burning in my chest. "That money was meant for my master's degree. You promised me that fund was untouchable." My father leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me, not with guilt, but with profound annoyance. "You are being selfish, Calliope. Your brother was facing potential jail time. He is the heir to Tazanna Developments. A scandal would ruin his trajectory in the commercial real estate market." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the casual cruelty in his logic. "He is incompetent," I said, the truth finally spilling out. "He cannot even read a balance sheet. I graduated top of my class. I earned that degree." My father sighed, the kind of heavy, patronizing sigh you give a toddler throwing a tantrum. "A master's degree is a vanity project for a woman in your position. Julian is the family's future. You will just marry into someone else's." Those words hung in the stale air of the study. Julian is the family's future. You will just marry into someone else's. In that fraction of a second, the illusion shattered. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, and I realized he only saw me as an asset to be liquidated for his son's benefit. He was gaslighting me, attempting to frame his theft as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of a legacy I was explicitly excluded from. I looked over at the doorway. Julian was standing there, nursing a cup of black coffee. He did not look apologetic. He offered me a faint, dismissive smirk, knowing he was untouchable. I did not scream. I did not throw the crystal paperweight sitting on the desk. Crying and screaming are tactics for people who believe their pain will change the mind of their abuser. I knew right then that no amount of logic, no amount of perfect grades, and no amount of pleading would ever make my father value me. To him, I was decorative. To Julian, I was a stepping stone. That office was not just a room, it was a financial and emotional prison. I realized I could not negotiate my way out of it. I had to escape it entirely. I picked up my laptop, turned my back on both of them, and walked up the stairs to my bedroom. I packed 2 suitcases. I left behind the designer clothes my father had bought me for country club dinners, taking only what I had purchased with my own part-time tutoring money. I drove away from that sprawling Greenwich estate without saying goodbye, armed with nothing but a bachelor's degree and a cold, hardening resolve to never let another human being dictate my worth. For years, my father believed his theft was the end of the story. He thought he had successfully clipped my wings, ensuring Julian would inherit the sky without any competition. He underestimated me, but more importantly, he underestimated the one man who had been silently watching this toxic dynamic unfold for decades. Grandfather Harrison was the architect of our family's wealth. He was a self-made titan who built a logistics and real estate empire from the ground up during the 70s. Unlike my father, who merely inherited his position and coasted on the family name, Harrison possessed a razor-sharp intellect and a ruthless ability to read people. By his late 80s, his physical health was declining, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp. Harrison rarely attended our Sunday family dinners, preferring the quiet solitude of his own estate across town. But on the rare occasions he did join us, he spent his time observing. He watched my father shower Julian with unearned praise. He watched Julian struggle to articulate basic business concepts over dessert. And he watched me. I remember a specific afternoon just months before I left for good, when Grandfather Harrison found me in the library. I was reviewing a complex predictive market analysis I had built for my senior thesis. He stood over my shoulder, silently reading the data points on my screen. He did not offer empty praise. He simply pointed to a variable in my algorithm, suggested a subtle correction to the inflation metric, and nodded when I instantly grasped his logic. "You have the mind of a builder, Calliope," he had murmured, his voice raspy but firm. "Your brother has the mind of a tenant." I did not fully understand the weight of his words that afternoon. I did not know that Grandfather Harrison had already seen through my father's delusions of grandeur. He recognized that Julian would run the Tazanna legacy straight into the ground, and he knew my father was too blinded by his own patriarchal pride to stop it. Harrison realized the wrong grandchild was being crowned. And a man who builds an empire from scratch does not let a fool burn it down without setting up a failsafe. I thought I was walking away from my family with nothing. I had no idea that Grandfather Harrison had already begun drafting the blueprint for my revenge, setting the stage for a secret meeting that would rewrite the future of the Tazanna bloodline. 5 years ago, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. I was living in a cramped Chicago apartment, eating instant noodles and working 70 hours a week as a junior financial analyst. The text contained a time, a gate code, and a simple directive. "Come to the mountaintop estate tonight. Tell no one, especially your father." I recognized the address instantly. It belonged to Grandfather Harrison. My grandfather did not live in a flashy Greenwich mansion like my father. Harrison resided in a brutalist stone fortress tucked deep into the Berkshire Mountains. He despised ostentatious displays of wealth. He built his multi-billion-dollar empire during the gritty industrial boom of the late 20th century, negotiating shipping contracts and acquiring distressed commercial real estate. He knew the value of a dollar because he had earned every single one of them. My father, Richard, only knew how to spend them. I rented a cheap sedan and drove through the night, rain slicking the mountain roads. When I arrived at the estate, the heavy iron gates swung open automatically. A tall man in a charcoal bespoke suit waited on the stone steps. He possessed the sharp, predatory stillness of a seasoned corporate litigator. "Miss Tazanna," he said, extending a firm hand, "I'm Sterling Pierce, Chief Legal Counsel to your grandfather. We do not have much time." Sterling led me through the cavernous, unlit halls of the estate. The air smelled of aged cedar and impending grief. We entered the primary suite. The room was sparsely furnished, dominated by a heavy oak bed. Grandfather Harrison lay there, connected to oxygen tubes. His body was frail, hollowed out by terminal illness, but his eyes retained that terrifying, piercing clarity that had made rival CEOs crumble in boardrooms. "Sit down," Calliope Harrison rasped, pointing a trembling finger at a leather chair beside his bed. I sat. Sterling remained standing near the door, a silent sentinel guarding the perimeter. My grandfather took a slow, ragged breath. "The doctors give me 3 weeks," he said, his voice devoid of self-pity. "It is a factual timeline, which means we must finalize the architecture of the real inheritance tonight." I stared at him, confused. "Dad and Julian have been boasting about the estate transition for months," I replied. "Julian already ordered customized business cards with the CEO title." Harrison let out a harsh, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. "Richard is a fool," he wheezed, "and Julian is a parasite. They view my life's work as a personal ATM. They will liquidate the actual assets to fund their country club lifestyle. I have spent 80 years building a dynasty, and I refuse to let 2 entitled, mediocre men dismantle it." He gestured weakly towards Sterling. The attorney stepped forward, opening a sleek leather briefcase on the bedside table. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy cream paper, bearing the official seal of the state of Massachusetts. Sterling adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. "For the past 6 months, your grandfather and I have been quietly restructuring the holding companies, Miss Tazanna. Your father will inherit the primary real estate firm. He believes that is the entirety of the wealth. He is incorrect." Harrison locked his sharp gaze onto mine. "I watched you, Calliope. I watched you run those predictive market algorithms in my library. I saw how you handled yourself when Richard stole your tuition. You did not weep. You did not beg. You packed your bags and you left. You possess the mind of a builder. You share my blood and my instincts." Sterling slid the first document across the mahogany table. "This is an irrevocable blind trust," Sterling explained, his tone clinical and precise. "It is funded with $5 million in liquid capital diverted from offshore accounts your father knows nothing about. It is shielded from the probate process. Richard cannot contest it. Richard cannot freeze it, because legally, Richard will never even know it exists until the trap springs." I looked down at the documents, my pulse quickening. $5 million. It was a staggering amount of capital, but the legal headers contained unusual stipulations. There is a condition I noted scanning the densely packed legal jargon. Harrison nodded slowly. "A specific trigger mechanism. The funds do not unlock simply because I pass away. The trust remains dormant, accumulating compounding interest under Sterling's management. It only activates upon a singular event." I read the highlighted clause aloud. "The trust shall execute and transfer all assets to Calliope Tazanna solely upon the birth of her first female heir." I looked up at my grandfather, my mind racing to process the strategic brilliance of the move. "Why a female heir?" I asked. "Because the men in this family have proven themselves unworthy," Harrison said, his voice hardening into steel. "Richard believes women exist merely to look pretty and marry well. He thinks legacy requires a son. I want to punish that arrogance. I want the true power of this bloodline to bypass his fragile ego entirely and flow directly to the women he dismisses." Sterling tapped the signature line. "If you sign this, you accept the burden of total silence. You must return to your life in Chicago. You must continue to let your father believe you are struggling. You cannot use this money to pay your rent or fund your startup. You must wait." The psychological weight of the request settled over me. It meant attending family functions and enduring my father's sneering remarks. It meant watching Julian flaunt his unearned luxury cars while I checked my bank balance for grocery money. It meant playing the role of the defeated outcast while secretly holding the keys to the kingdom. I looked at the signature line. The paper represented more than just wealth. It represented vindication. It was a loaded weapon hidden in plain sight. Harrison reached over, his hand shaking slightly. He held out his vintage gold fountain pen. It was the same pen he used to sign his very first commercial shipping contract 50 years ago. The brass was worn smooth from decades of closing ruthless deals. "Take it," he whispered, his eyes burning with intense, fierce pride. "Sign the paper." I took the heavy gold pen. The ink flowed dark and permanent across the cream-colored page. I signed my full name, binding myself to the secret. Harrison sank back into his pillows, a faint, satisfied smile touching his lips. He watched me cap the pen. "Let them think they have won, Calliope," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. "Let them think they have won, right until you own the board." I slipped the copy of the trust into my coat pocket. Sterling nodded respectfully, sealing the original documents back into his briefcase. I walked out of that fortress in the Berkshires, leaving my grandfather to his final rest. I drove back to Chicago as the sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fierce orange. 3 weeks later, Grandfather Harrison passed away. The funeral was an exercise in grotesque theater. My father stood at the pulpit delivering a booming eulogy about carrying the torch of the Tazanna legacy. He wore a custom-tailored morning suit. Julian stood beside him, looking profoundly bored, checking his phone under the pew. They hosted a lavish reception at their country club, drinking top-shelf scotch and accepting condolences from politicians and bankers. Richard immediately assumed the mantle of the patriarch. He moved into the corner office of Tazanna Developments, redesigning it with imported Italian leather and abstract art he did not understand. He treated the company treasury like a personal slush fund, convinced he had inherited the entire empire, unchecked and unchallenged. During the reception, my father cornered me near the coat check. He looked me up and down, taking in my off-the-rack black dress. "I suppose you will be heading back to that miserable little apartment in Chicago," he sneered, swirling his scotch. "Do not expect any handouts from the estate, Calliope. Julian and I have a company to run. We cannot subsidize your failures." I looked at the man who had stolen my tuition, the man who valued his son's drunk driving cover-ups over my education. I felt the crisp edge of the trust document folded securely in the lining of my purse. The secret burned against my ribs, a glorious, invisible armor. "I do not need your money, Dad," I said, my voice cool and flat. He laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound, and walked away to rejoin his wealthy friends. He had no idea that a covert war had just been declared. He thought he was playing chess against a defeated opponent. He did not realize my grandfather had already flipped the board. I returned to Chicago embracing the shadows. I knew I could not just wait around for a trust fund to unlock. I needed to build my own leverage. I needed to construct an empire of my own, one that would eventually wrap its fingers right around my father's throat. I returned to the Midwest with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet, burning determination. My father formally severed my financial ties the morning after Grandfather Harrison was buried. The bank accounts attached to my Greenwich address were swiftly frozen. My father assumed financial starvation would force me to crawl back to Connecticut and beg for an entry-level clerical job at his firm. He fundamentally misunderstood how starvation works. It does not make you weak. It makes you sharp. I took my summa cum laude finance degree and secured a junior position at a ruthless investment bank in the Chicago Loop. I worked 90-hour weeks. I ate lukewarm takeout at my desk, while my peers frequented expensive steakhouses and complained about their bonuses. I saved every commission, every performance reward, every spare dollar. I was not building a standard retirement portfolio. I was building a war chest. 3 years later, I walked away from the bank to launch my own venture capital and wealth management firm. I named it Vanguard Horizon. I specifically targeted distressed assets. I hunted for companies that were over-leveraged, poorly managed, and bleeding capital. I sought out businesses run by men exactly like my father and brother. Men who coasted on inherited reputations while their corporate balance sheets rotted from the inside out. Because of my gender and my relative youth, the traditional old boys club of Chicago finance underestimated me. I weaponized that invisibility. I let the older male executives talk over me in preliminary negotiations, assuming I was merely a junior assistant taking notes. I maintained a polite, neutral expression right up until the moment I slid the acquisition paperwork across the mahogany table and bought their failing companies for pennies on the dollar. Privacy became my greatest strategic advantage. I routed my ownership through a complex labyrinth of corporate entities, blind trusts, and holding companies registered in Delaware. If anyone attempted to dig into the structural hierarchy of Vanguard Horizon, they would hit a brick wall of legal proxies and non-disclosure agreements. I needed to ensure my last name never appeared on a public masthead or a Forbes list. My family could never know I was succeeding. To them, I had to remain the disgraced daughter, the stubborn outcast, struggling to make rent in a windy city. By my 30th birthday, Vanguard Horizon crossed the 8-figure threshold in net worth. I owned commercial real estate across the Midwest, a portfolio of lucrative tech startups, and a sprawling glass penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Yet I maintained the flawless illusion of failure for anyone looking from the East Coast. This bizarre dynamic was perfectly illustrated on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in my glass-walled boardroom high above the Chicago skyline. My lead counsel was preparing the final signature pages for a $12 million acquisition of a failing regional logistics chain. My personal phone vibrated on the polished table. It was a group text message from Vanessa, my newly acquired sister-in-law. Julian had married Vanessa 2 years prior in a lavish ceremony featured in regional lifestyle magazines. Vanessa was the quintessential country club archetype. She possessed impeccable blonde highlights, a closet full of tennis skirts, and a deep, unearned sense of superiority. She had married Julian specifically for the Tazanna legacy, viewing herself as the new matriarch in training. She treated me with a cloying fake sympathy that masked a venomous condescension. The text message included a photo of Vanessa holding a designer handbag lounging on the teak deck of my father's yacht. The caption read, "Just thinking of you, Calliope." Julian says the winters out there are brutal for people taking public transit. Let us know if you need us to send an old winter coat down. Hope you are surviving. I stared at the glowing screen. Vanessa thought she was taunting a helpless victim. She believed her proximity to my brother's inherited wealth made her powerful. She drew her entire identity from a man who could not even read a profit and loss statement without asking his accountant for help. I did not reply. I did not block her number. I simply muted the conversation, picked up my favorite heavy tortoiseshell pen, and signed my name on the dotted line of the contract in front of me. With a few precise strokes of ink, I closed a $12 million deal, adding another highly lucrative asset to my private empire. I handed the leather-bound portfolio back to my attorney, who nodded in quiet respect. I did not need an old winter coat from my brother's wife. I owned the skyscraper I was currently sitting in. But financial success was only half of the equation. Wealth alone would not balance the scales. I needed leverage over the men who had stolen my future and tried to dictate my worth. I spent my evenings meticulously tracking the commercial real estate market in Connecticut. I monitored the public filings, the zoning permits, the subtle shifts in capital that reveal a development company's true health. My father was a proud man who cared far more about optics than actual liquidity. He hosted extravagant charity galas and sponsored prestigious golf tournaments while taking out predatory high-interest loans to cover his basic operational costs. Julian, acting as the newly appointed vice president of operations, was rapidly accelerating the corporate decline. Julian lacked the attention to detail required to manage municipal building contracts, leading to a series of expensive fines and stalled residential development projects. The cracks in their gilded facade finally widened into a treacherous canyon during the third quarter of the fiscal year. My chief acquisitions officer walked into my office carrying a thick red folder. We had been purchasing bundled commercial debt from institutional lenders looking for salvageable properties. He placed the folder on my desk, explaining that a major East Coast bank was quietly offloading a portfolio of high-risk real estate loans. The original borrower had missed 3 consecutive quarterly payments and was begging the bank for a favorable restructuring plan. The bank wanted to dump the toxic assets and wash their hands of the mess. I opened the folder. The top document featured the familiar embossed crest of Tazanna Developments. I read through the financial disclosures, and my blood ran cold. It was worse than I had ever imagined. My father had leveraged his primary commercial properties to fund a disastrous luxury condominium project spearheaded by Julian. The project was drowning in litigation over environmental violations and delayed city permits. The company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. The bank was exhausted by Julian's arrogant email demands and my father's empty promises. They wanted to sell the debt immediately. I did not hesitate. I instructed my team to acquire the entire portfolio through one of my anonymous Delaware holding entities. We bought the paper at a steep discount, the transaction clearing within 48 hours. I sat alone in my penthouse, looking out over the dark waters of Lake Michigan, holding the final confirmation statement in my hands. My father and brother were still living in their Greenwich mansion, throwing lavish dinner parties and pretending they ruled the world. They thought they were merely negotiating a temporary financial setback with a faceless Chicago private equity firm. They had no idea the faceless firm was me. I had just become the primary creditor of Tazanna Developments. I owned their debt. I held their financial survival in the palm of my hand. The trap was perfectly set, and the timing could not have been more poetic. It was time to invite my family to their own execution. Julian, assuming the role of Vice President of Operations, was a masterclass in unchecked nepotism. He treated the executive suite like an extended fraternity presidency. Rather than auditing supply chains or securing essential municipal permits, he scheduled 3-hour lunches at exclusive steakhouses and expensed private helicopter flights to inspect development sites located a mere 30-minute drive away. Under his guidance, the company ceased functioning as a profitable enterprise and morphed into a personal slush fund. The catalyst for their downfall was a luxury waterfront condominium project. Julian spearheaded the initiative, promising his country club peers a revolutionary residential experience. He broke ground before securing the necessary environmental clearances. When the state regulators discovered the oversight, they halted construction indefinitely. The steel scaffolding rusted in the salt air. Construction crews walked off the job citing unpaid invoices. Subcontractors filed liens against the property. My father attempted to plug the financial holes by leveraging their remaining stable assets. Richard obsessed over optics. He operated under the dangerous assumption that projecting wealth would magically generate liquidity. But commercial real estate is a ruthless, unyielding arena. Institutional lenders ignore the thread count of a bespoke suit. They focus solely on debt-to-equity ratios. When the regional banks realized the waterfront initiative was paralyzed, they stopped returning Richard's phone calls. The financial squeeze arrived quietly, a slow, suffocating tightening of the corporate noose. Desperation forced my father and brother to look beyond their traditional East Coast financial safety nets. Their local reputation was actively decaying. They required an infusion of fresh capital from an external source, unburdened by local gossip. They instructed their brokers to cast a wide net, seeking a debt restructuring package from out-of-state private equity firms. They sought an entity willing to assume high-risk, distressed commercial loans. Their search led them directly to Vanguard Horizon. They compiled their operational history and submitted a formal request for a financial bailout to my Chicago headquarters. They remained blissfully ignorant of the fact that the silent majority partner reviewing their plea was the same daughter they had financially exiled years prior. I was sitting in my corner office watching the morning fog roll off Lake Michigan when my lead acquisitions officer forwarded a specific email to my secure inbox. It was a direct communication originating from the desk of Julian Tazanna. I opened the message, anticipating a tone of desperate humility. I forgot who I was dealing with. Julian did not write like a man begging for a corporate lifeline. He composed the email with the unearned arrogance of a monarch granting a peasant a rare privilege. We are willing to offer your firm the exclusive opportunity to restructure our current liabilities, Julian typed. Given the historical prestige of the Tazanna brand within the Connecticut real estate market, we expect favorable interest terms and an expedited processing timeline. We do not entertain extensive external audits. Our internal projections speak for themselves. I read the text twice, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from the screen. He was demanding premium treatment while his corporate vessel was actively sinking. He believed the mere mention of our family name would force a major financial institution to bypass standard due diligence. It was a perfect encapsulation of the toxic entitlement that defined his entire existence. I ignored his ridiculous stipulations and authorized my accounting division to conduct a forensic deep dive into their submitted ledgers. We bypassed their sanitized summaries and dug into the raw, unredacted transactional data. When the comprehensive report populated on my monitor, the true extent of my father's financial rot was laid bare in stark black and white numbers. It was a pathetic spectacle. Richard had squandered millions to maintain a fictional lifestyle. The company books were riddled with personal expenses deliberately miscategorized as corporate marketing initiatives. I traced the line items with a growing sense of cold validation. I found country club initiation fees for Julian's friends buried under client entertainment. I discovered Vanessa's exorbitant interior design consultations billed as office renovations. I saw staggering monthly lease payments for a fleet of luxury sedans they did not actually own. My father and brother were living paycheck to paycheck, just on a corporate scale. They were drowning in predatory, high-interest loans they had taken out simply to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing at their weekend galas. I leaned back in my chair, the soft leather creaking in the quiet office. I held their financial lifeblood in my hands. The Vanguard Horizon acquisition team had already quietly purchased their primary debt obligations from the regional banks. If I issued a single directive, I could force Tazanna Developments into immediate insolvency. I could initiate foreclosure proceedings on their flagship properties and watch their empire crumble from the comfort of my Chicago penthouse. But a quiet, sterile boardroom execution felt insufficient. Liquidating their assets via email lacked a certain necessary poetry. They had stolen my future and humiliated me in front of our entire social circle. I needed to return the favor. I required a stage. I needed an audience of their peers to witness the collapse of their gilded facade. The corporate timeline was accelerating rapidly, and it intersected perfectly with a major development in my personal life. I was navigating my third trimester of a solo pregnancy. I had utilized a highly exclusive donor clinic, choosing to build my own family without the complications of a partner. I was expecting twin girls. For months, my family had practically ignored my impending motherhood. I was the disgraced daughter living far away, so my pregnancy was treated as a shameful secret rather than a cause for celebration. Then the financial crisis escalated, and their behavior abruptly shifted. My sister-in-law Vanessa initiated contact. The Tazanna men were panicking. They needed a public relations victory to project an image of stability and unity to their nervous local investors. A lavish family event would serve as the perfect distraction, a way to signal to the market that the Tazanna dynasty was thriving and focused on the future. Vanessa proposed hosting a baby shower. The audacity was breathtaking. She did not care about my children. She and Julian wanted to use my unborn daughters as a human shield for their failing enterprise. They intended to invite their wealthy creditors and skeptical partners to a sprawling party, using my pregnancy as a convenient prop to secure more time on their loans. I read Vanessa's cloying text message suggesting a modest gathering at a local country club. A cold, strategic smile crept across my face. I saw the perfect opportunity to merge the two timelines into one devastating collision. I would give them the public spectacle they desperately craved. I agreed to the shower, but I refused their venue. I informed Vanessa I would handle the location and the catering myself. The trap was fully set. I was navigating the beginning of my third trimester. Becoming a mother was a deliberate, calculated decision, executed with the same precision I applied to corporate acquisitions. I did not want a partner. I had witnessed firsthand how the men in my social circle operated, viewing wives as decorative accessories and children as mere props to secure a legacy. I refused to subject my future to those antiquated patriarchal dynamics. I selected a highly exclusive donor clinic in Manhattan. I reviewed medical histories, genetic backgrounds, and psychological profiles with intense, relentless scrutiny. I was building my own family on my own terms, entirely insulated from the toxic grip of the Tazanna bloodline. I was expecting twin girls. My family treated my pregnancy like a scandalous secret. During the rare, mandatory holiday phone calls, my father would clear his throat and abruptly change the subject whenever my impending motherhood was mentioned. To Richard, an unmarried, pregnant daughter living in the Midwest was a social liability. He could not leverage my situation at his country club dinners to gain favor or secure business deals, so he chose to pretend the situation did not exist. He assumed I was hiding out of shame. He believed I was a broken woman raising a child in a cramped apartment, bracing for a life of perpetual financial struggle. He maintained this comfortable delusion right up until the financial rot inside Tazanna Developments reached a critical threshold. When you are drowning in commercial debt, perception becomes the only currency you have left to spend. My father and Julian needed to project an image of unshakable family stability to soothe the frayed nerves of their local Connecticut investors. A fractured family implies a fractured business. They required a public spectacle, a wholesome distraction, to convince the market that the Tazanna dynasty was thriving, unified, and focused on the future. That is when Vanessa called me. My sister-in-law possessed a shrill, practiced voice that always sounded like she was auditioning for a daytime television show. She bypassed all customary greetings and launched directly into her pitch. "Calliope," she chirped over the phone, "we have been thinking. It is simply a tragedy that you are out there all alone preparing for the babies. The family wants to throw you a proper shower. We want to bring you back into the fold." I let the silence stretch over the cellular connection. I could hear the sheer desperation hiding beneath her sugary tone. She did not care about my children. She cared about the guest list. She and Julian intended to pack a room full of skeptical bankers and wealthy creditors, using my unborn daughters as a human shield to deflect inquiries about their delayed construction permits and missed loan payments. They wanted to parade me around as the grateful prodigal daughter, proving to their peers that Richard was a benevolent patriarch who took care of his own. I could have declined the invitation. I could have hung up the phone and remained in my Chicago penthouse, enjoying the quiet peace I had built for myself. But a quiet, private victory was no longer sufficient. I held the financial lifeblood of their company in my Vanguard Horizon accounts. I just needed the perfect arena to execute the final blow. I needed to let their arrogance inflate to its maximum capacity so the resulting explosion would leave no survivors. "That sounds lovely, Vanessa," I replied, keeping my tone mild and perfectly compliant. "Oh, wonderful," she breathed, a genuine sigh of relief escaping her lips. Julian and I were thinking of booking the secondary dining room at the Fairfield Country Club. Nothing too extravagant, just a cozy afternoon with our closest associates. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that she could not see through the receiver. "I will not be celebrating my daughters in a secondary dining room," I told her. "If we are doing this, I will handle the venue and the catering myself. I have a location in mind." Vanessa hesitated. She knew my father would despise yielding control of the optics, but their public relations crisis superseded his ego. She agreed under the condition that they could manage the guest list. I granted them that concession eagerly. I wanted them to invite every single person they were trying to impress. 2 weeks later, I flew back to the East Coast. I did not book a luxury suite at a downtown hotel. I directed my private driver to navigate toward a secluded, wooded enclave in Connecticut, located just 40 minutes away from my father's Greenwich mansion. 3 years prior, I had diversified my personal real estate portfolio by purchasing a sprawling architectural masterpiece hidden behind towering iron gates and ancient oak trees. The property featured sweeping glass walls, imported marble floors, heated driveways, and a terraced courtyard designed specifically for hosting elite private gatherings. I paid $8 million for the estate, utilizing a blind trust and a single-wire transfer. It was my secret East Coast sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the empire I had built in the shadows. I stood in the breathtaking foyer, running my hand along the cool stone balustrade. The caterers were already outside, setting up silk floral arrangements and polishing hundreds of crystal glasses. The stage was being set with meticulous precision. My phone vibrated in my cashmere coat pocket. It was a text message from Richard. I opened the screen. My father had just received the venue address and the preliminary details of the event setup from his assistant. His message read, "Don't embarrass us, Calliope. Renting an estate you cannot afford is pathetic. Keep the catering cheap. Do not expect me to bail you out when the final bill arrives." I read the text twice, letting the sheer magnitude of his delusion wash over me. He still viewed me as the helpless 20-year-old girl whose tuition he had stolen over a decade ago. He believed I was stretching my meager credit limits to play pretend in a world I did not belong in. He assumed I was a temporary tenant in a kingdom he ruled. The psychological friction was delicious. He was standing on the precipice of ruin, trying to lecture the very person who owned the gravity pulling him down. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not bother sending a reply. The satisfaction of the impending revelation required no digital prelude. I preferred to let his false sense of superiority fester. The psychological warfare was reaching its apex. I spent the next 48 hours allowing my family to orchestrate their own demise. I reviewed the final guest list Vanessa had forwarded to my event coordinator. It was a veritable roster of Connecticut high society. Local politicians, commercial real estate brokers, and the very institutional lenders who were currently begging Vanguard Horizon to restructure the Tazanna debt. Every single person my father needed to impress was scheduled to walk through my front doors. I instructed the catering director to upgrade the menu, offering exotic caviar stations and the most expensive vintage champagne available on the eastern seaboard. I wanted the display of wealth to be so staggering that it would make my father deeply uncomfortable. I wanted him to feel the psychological burn of standing in a space far more opulent than his own home, while wrongly believing his disgraced daughter was footing the bill on borrowed time. I wanted him to think I was driving myself into bankruptcy just to impress him. The evening before the shower, I walked through the quiet, empty courtyard alone. The string quartet had set up their elegant wooden chairs near the manicured hedges. The pristine gift tables were draped in heavy white linen, waiting for the obligatory offerings. The balloon drop mechanism, a highly theatrical touch I had specifically requested, was secured firmly above the main stone terrace. Everything was ready. The illusion was flawless. The trap was hidden beneath layers of pink silk and expensive hors d'oeuvres. My family thought they were walking into a desperate public relations stunt engineered to save their failing company and bolster their social standing. They had no idea they were marching directly into a financial guillotine. I placed a hand on my pregnant stomach, feeling a sudden reassuring kick from one of my daughters. The morning sun would soon rise over the Connecticut hills, bringing with it the ultimate collision of perception and reality. The audience was about to take their seats. The morning sun burned off the autumn frost as a procession of dark, luxury vehicles began to line the winding driveway of my secluded property. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open doors for the 150 guests Vanessa had carefully curated. I stood near the grand entrance, watching the Connecticut elite step onto the imported stone of my foyer. They moved with that distinct, languid confidence inherent to old money, wearing pastel linens and bespoke navy blazers. They admired the soaring glass walls and the manicured terraces, exchanging hushed whispers about the exorbitant cost of such a rental. Not a single person walking through those heavy mahogany doors realized they were wiping their expensive leather shoes on a welcome mat that I owned outright. I played the role of the gracious, impoverished hostess perfectly. I offered warm smiles and polite nods, accepting their patronizing congratulations, while silently calculating the exact net worth of every individual in the room. Julian and Vanessa arrived nearly an hour late, a deliberate tactic designed to ensure they made a grand entrance. Julian looked terrible. The stress of his impending corporate insolvency had carved deep lines around his eyes. He bypassed the receiving line entirely, making a direct path for the temporary bar set up on the patio to order a double scotch. He did not look like a triumphant heir. He looked like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Vanessa, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. She wore a tailored designer dress that cost more than my first car, projecting an illusion of flawless prosperity. Her marriage was quietly unraveling alongside the family business. Julian barely spoke to her anymore, preferring the company of his country club bartender. But Vanessa clung to the Tazanna name like a life preserver. She needed this baby shower to prove her continued relevance in the social hierarchy. She spotted me standing near the cascading floral arrangements and marched over, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble. Calliope, she beamed, her voice pitched loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "You look so tired." Carrying twins must be exhausting, especially doing it all by yourself. I maintained a serene expression, sipping from a tall glass of sparkling water. "I am feeling wonderful, Vanessa," I replied, keeping my tone even and unbothered. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into a register of mock sympathy. "It is very brave of you using a clinic like that. Raising children without a father in the picture is such a daunting burden. It takes a village, darling. We just hope you understand the realities of your situation." She was projecting her own deep-seated terrors onto my pregnancy. She had a husband, but she was arguably more alone than I had ever been. She thrust a small, poorly wrapped rectangular box toward me. "A little token from Julian and me," she announced. I unwrapped the paper, revealing a generic, thin fleece baby blanket from a mid-tier department store. It still had a clearance sticker adhered to the plastic packaging. The insult was intentional and precise. A few feet away, the main gift table groaned under the weight of silver rattles, cashmere sweaters, and Hermes diaper bags, presented by the various bankers and investors attempting to curry favor with my father. Vanessa handed me a discount blanket to remind me of my subordinate place in her mind. I did not react with anger. I simply smiled, a genuine, warm smile, thanked her for her generosity, and handed the cheap fleece to a passing catering assistant. I knew something she did not. Her designer dress was purchased on a credit card her husband could no longer pay off, while I could have purchased the entire department store without checking my balance. Leaving Vanessa to mingle, I drifted toward the edge of the central courtyard. My father was holding court near a towering ice sculpture, surrounded by 3 older men wearing expensive watches and skeptical expressions. These were the institutional lenders, the men Richard desperately needed to appease. He was performing his role with practiced theatricality, gesturing broadly and laughing a little too loud. I stood just behind a row of manicured boxwoods out of his direct line of sight, but close enough to hear every word of his pitch. "The real estate market is undergoing a necessary correction, gentlemen," Richard declared, swirling his champagne. "Tazanna Developments is perfectly positioned to weather this minor storm. We are just dealing with a temporary liquidity bottleneck caused by some overly cautious bureaucrats." One of the bankers, a silver-haired man with sharp, calculating eyes, took a slow sip of his drink. We heard your primary debt was acquired by a private equity firm out of Chicago, Richard, Vanguard Horizon. Word is they are playing hardball on the restructuring terms. My father scoffed, waving his hand as if swatting away a minor insect. Faceless spreadsheet pushers, he sneered, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. They lack the vision to understand East Coast development projects. They are demanding ridiculous external audits and trying to dictate my operational timelines. It is a minor nuisance. I am flying out there next week to sit down with their managing partner. I will remind them who they are dealing with. I will have them offering us an extended grace period by the end of the lunch meeting. I stood hidden behind the hedges listening to the man who stole my tuition describe his plan to intimidate my own corporate entity. He truly believed his last name was a magical incantation that could bend the laws of high finance. He thought he could walk into my Chicago headquarters, demand a favorable interest rate, and walk out victorious. He had no idea the managing partner he intended to bully was currently standing 10 feet away drinking sparkling water and paying the staff serving his hors d'oeuvres. The overlapping layers of my current reality created a surreal, dizzying atmosphere. I looked to them. I was the disgraced pregnant daughter, the financial failure who had to beg her estranged family for a social lifeline. They whispered behind their hands, pitying my lack of a husband and mocking my presumed poverty. Yet beneath their feet lay the bedrock of my personal empire. I held the deed to the ground they stood on. I owned the mortgages attached to their commercial buildings. I controlled the debt that dictated whether their companies would survive the fiscal year. I was a ghost, haunting a party thrown in my own honor, holding the executioner switch in the palm of my hand. The afternoon began to wane. The autumn sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, elegant shadows across the terrace. The catering director caught my eye and delivered a subtle nod, signaling that the final preparations were complete. The vintage champagne had been poured into a towering pyramid of crystal flutes. The elaborate floral centerpieces were pristine. The hidden mechanism suspended high above the courtyard, holding thousands of pink confetti pieces, was primed and ready for activation. The stage was set with terrifying perfection. My father finished his conversation with the bankers. He checked his reflection in the glass doors, smoothed the lapels of his custom jacket, and signaled for the string quartet to cease playing. The delicate classical music faded into the crisp air. The low hum of 100 varying conversations began to taper off as the guests noticed his movement. He stepped up to the edge of the balcony, elevating himself above the crowd. He reached over, taking a fresh flute of champagne from a passing silver tray. He pulled a heavy silver spoon from his pocket. The air in the courtyard grew still thick with anticipation and the toxic weight of unspoken power dynamics. He tapped the spoon against the delicate crystal, producing a sharp, ringing sound that commanded immediate, total silence. He smiled out at the audience, his eyes eventually finding me standing alone near the gift table. The trap was ready to spring. The ringing of the silver spoon against crystal echoed across the terraced lawn. 150 guests halted their conversations, turning their attention toward the elevated stone balcony where my father stood. Richard possessed a distinct talent for monopolizing the oxygen in any given environment. He stepped up to the microphone stand that the catering staff had hastily erected near the imported floral arches. He adjusted his tailored jacket lapels, projecting the aura of a benevolent king surveying his loyal subjects. He did not look like an executive teetering on the edge of severe financial ruin. He looked like a man who genuinely believed his own intricate fictions. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice amplified and booming over the hidden speakers tucked into the manicured hedges. "It is a profound joy to gather our closest friends and most esteemed colleagues here this afternoon." He gestured expansively toward the crowd, specifically making extended eye contact with the silver-haired banking executives standing near the towering ice sculpture. We Tazannas have always believed that family is the unbreakable bedrock of any successful enterprise. We endure market corrections. We build foundations. we look toward the horizon. He was utilizing my pregnancy as a corporate mission statement. It was a sickening display of public relations masquerading as paternal affection. I stood beside the gift table, feeling the heavy weight of the stares from the country club elite. They viewed me as the prodigal daughter, welcomed back into the fold solely by the grace of a generous and forgiving patriarch. Richard paused, letting his opening remarks settle over the quiet courtyard. He reached for his champagne glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip to maximize the theatrical tension of the moment. Julien positioned himself half a step behind our father. My older brother leaned against the marble balustrade, exuding an unearned, staggering arrogance. He lifted his left arm, pulling back his crisp white shirt cuff to inspect his Rolex Daytona. The expensive watch caught the late afternoon sunlight flashing brilliantly across the patio. Julien offered a faint, superior sneer to a group of young associates gathered near the bar, looking every inch the protected heir apparent. He was 34 years old, yet he still required our father to fight his battles, cover his staggering debts, and clean up his continuous municipal blunders. Julien did not care about the impending birth of my children. He only cared that this elaborate party might buy him another fiscal quarter to play real estate developer with the bank's money. My father lowered his crystal glass and shifted his posture. The practiced warmth vanished from his features, replaced by a hard, calculating edge. He needed to demonstrate his ultimate authority to the creditors watching his every move. He had to prove he held the reins of the dynasty tightly and that no capital would be mismanaged or diverted to unworthy causes under his watch. To accomplish that goal, he decided to make a public example out of the easiest target in the room. He turned his head and locked his predatory gaze directly onto me. "Calliope," he said, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet estate. "You have returned to us from the Midwest, carrying the next chapter of our bloodline. We are all eager to see the next generation of the Tazanna Empire arrive." He offered a tight, closed-mouth smile that did not reach his eyes. But as the steward of this family and the sole guardian of our corporate interests, I must ensure our future remains secure. He looked back out at the crowd, addressing the financiers more than his own flesh and blood. "We operate in a ruthless world, gentlemen. Survival requires undeniable strength. It requires an unbroken chain of command and an unwavering commitment to the family name." He turned back to me, raising his chin higher. "So let me make one family rule clear today before we cut the cake." The courtyard grew unnervingly still. Even the catering staff stopped moving, hovering near the perimeter with silver trays held motionless in their hands. The gentle breeze rustled the autumn leaves, but otherwise, the silence was total. I kept my face blank, betraying no emotion, as my father prepared to deliver his finishing blow. "If this baby is a girl," he announced, his tone sharp and unyielding, "do not expect an inheritance from me. Do not expect a trust fund or a seat at the boardroom table. The Tazanna wealth flows exclusively to male heirs. Men build and protect the legacy. Women simply marry into someone else's." The overt misogyny hung in the crisp air, thick and suffocating. It was an explicit attempted erasure of my unborn children. He was publicly stripping my daughters of their worth before they even drew their first breath. He was weaponizing their gender as a rhetorical punchline to impress a group of aging executives, proving his iron grip on the family treasury. He wanted the entire social circle to know that I remained a permanent subordinate, a decorative afterthought, who would never touch a single dime of the commercial real estate fortune. A profound, uncomfortable silence blanketed the property. I watched the reactions ripple through the affluent crowd. The wealthy wives immediately lowered their eyes, staring intensely at their designer shoes or swirling the dregs of their drinks. They exchanged quick, pathetic glances, bound by the same invisible chains of financial dependency that my father was currently glorifying. The male executives shifted their weight, clearing their throats and looking mildly awkward. Yet not a single person spoke up to defend me. Not one individual challenged his blatant public cruelty. They were silent enablers, complicit in the toxic hierarchy that kept their own bank accounts insulated and their social standing secure. Julian let out a low, audible chuckle that carried across the terrace. He pushed off the stone railing, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a triumphant gleam in his eye, thrilled to witness my degradation. He assumed my spirit was finally breaking under the pressure. He thought this grand humiliation would send me running back to Chicago in tears, ensuring he would never have to share the spotlight or the corporate spoils. He believed the natural order of the universe was asserting itself, confirming his divine right to rule. My father stood on the balcony, his chest puffed out, soaking in the terrified silence of his peers. He waited for my reaction. He expected my shoulders to slump in defeat. He anticipated the familiar sting of tears forming in my eyes, the hallmark of the broken daughter he had conditioned for 3 decades. He wanted me to shrink into the background, to lower my head and accept my designated place at the very bottom of the food chain. I did not shrink. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my mind, dispelling any lingering shadows of childhood intimidation. The psychological warfare had just reached its absolute peak. My father had intended to scorch the earth beneath my feet, but he had merely handed me the match to ignite his own funeral pyre. He had painted himself as the supreme commander of a wealth he no longer controlled, standing on a property he did not own, boasting to investors whose very debt I had already purchased and filed away in a steel cabinet in Illinois. I took a long, slow breath of the cool Connecticut air. My heart beat with a steady, even rhythm, free of panic or sorrow. I set my glass of sparkling water down on the linen-draped table. The heavy crystal base met the wood with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the quiet space. I squared my shoulders and took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between my silent observation post and the center of the lawn. My demeanor remained icy, unbothered, and terrifyingly calm. The stage was mine now, and the curtain was finally ready to rise. I walked toward the stone balcony. The distance across the manicured lawn felt both infinite and instantaneous. The guests parted like the Red Sea, stepping aside to clear my path. Their eyes tracked my every movement, studying the pregnant woman who had just been publicly stripped of her inheritance. I did not glare at my father. I did not look at Julian. I kept my gaze fixed on the catering director, standing near the perimeter wall, holding a small, black remote control. When I reached the base of the short stone staircase leading to the elevated terrace, I stopped. I offered the director a single, sharp nod. A loud, mechanical snap echoed above the courtyard. The concealed canvas rig suspended high between the ancient oak trees tore open. A thick, dense cloud of vibrant pink confetti plummeted from the sky. It rained down over the terrace, blanketing the imported marble coating the lavish floral arrangements and sticking to my father's dark, tailored shoulders. Twin girls. The message was unmistakable and inescapable. My father stood frozen in the center of the pink downpour. A single piece of bright pink tissue paper landed square on his forehead. He looked utterly ridiculous, stripped of his manufactured gravitas. He opened his mouth, his mind struggling to process the visual spectacle that had just hijacked his corporate monologue. Before he could recover from the shock, I climbed the 3 stone steps. I walked directly up to him and pulled the microphone from his slack grip. The metal was warm from his hand, but my grasp was cold and unyielding. I turned my back on him, facing the 150 guests. The silver-haired bankers who had nodded along to his misogynistic speech seconds ago were now staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The wealthy country club wives ceased their polite whispering. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of the remaining confetti settling onto the grass. "They do not need your money, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the lawn, carrying the steady, measured cadence of a chief executive closing a hostile takeover. I reached inside my leather tote bag and retrieved the heavy, cream-colored envelope. I unclasped the wax seal and extracted the thick, legal folio. The state of Massachusetts notary stamp gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Because Grandfather Harrison had a different vision for the future of this family, I continued holding the crisp parchment up for the front row of investors to see. 5 years ago, while you were busy ordering custom business cards and picking out imported sports cars for Julian, your father recognized the true trajectory of Tazanna developments. He understood that placing his legacy in the hands of two arrogant men would result in total financial ruin. So he constructed a failsafe. I unfolded the document, smoothing the thick paper with deliberate care. I found the highlighted clause and read the addendum verbatim, allowing my grandfather's final strategic maneuver to echo across the estate. To ensure my life's work is not squandered by the incompetent, this $5 million irrevocable trust is reserved solely for the women of this bloodline who have always been its true strength. The funds unlock today. The color drained from my father's face rapidly, leaving him looking hollow and aged. His right hand underwent a sudden involuntary spasm. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It struck the hard stone floor with a sharp, concussive shatter, sending shards of expensive glass and vintage champagne splashing across his polished leather shoes. That sound acted as a starting gun for his rage. The polished, aristocratic facade he had spent decades cultivating disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The veins in his neck bulged visibly against his crisp white collar. His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "That is a forgery," he bellowed, his voice cracking unpleasantly, stripped of the microphone's amplification. "It is a pathetic fabrication. I am the sole executor of the Harrison estate. I control the holding companies. I control the offshore accounts. You are a delusional, ungrateful child playing a stupid prank in front of my colleagues." Julian stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at me, his own panic rising to match our father's hysteria. "You cannot just print a fake document and expect us to believe it, Calliope," he stammered. "Dad will have his attorneys freeze whatever pathetic checking account you think you have access to. You are embarrassing yourself. You need to leave. I did not raise my voice to match their escalating frenzy. I let them yell. I stood perfectly still and allowed the institutional lenders to watch the current leadership of Tazanna Developments lose their composure and unravel over a single piece of paper. The contrast was damning. I was the picture of serene authority, while the men claiming to protect the legacy were throwing a temper tantrum surrounded by pink confetti. "You cannot freeze an asset you never knew existed," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. Sterling Pierce finalized this blind trust half a decade ago. It bypassed the probate courts entirely. You have zero legal jurisdiction over these funds. The mention of Sterling Pierce sent a visible shockwave through the crowd of investors. Pierce was a legendary corporate shark, a man known throughout the East Coast financial sector for drafting ironclad, impenetrable legal structures. The bankers began stepping back, physically distancing themselves from Richard. They smelled blood in the water. If Richard had lied about his absolute control over his own family trust, what else was he hiding in his corporate ledgers? The illusion of his supreme command was permanently punctured. Richard looked around the courtyard, witnessing the shifting dynamics. He saw his wealthy peers whispering behind their hands, their expressions shifting from respect to stark skepticism. He realized his own father had viewed him as a profound failure, an incompetent steward who needed to be bypassed and managed from beyond the grave. The psychological wound was devastating. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the Harrison shadow, only to learn that the patriarch had handed the ultimate victory to the daughter Richard had discarded. He took a threatening step toward me, his chest heaving as he struggled to maintain some semblance of physical intimidation. "I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years, he hissed, saliva shining on his lips. "I will bury you in legal fees until you are bankrupt. I will hire every litigator in the tri-state area to break that trust. You will never see a single cent of that money." He still thought capital was his ultimate weapon. He still believed he held the high ground, assuming a lengthy court battle would drain my limited resources. He thought a $5 million trust fund was the full extent of my arsenal. He was treating the paper in my hand as the primary threat, entirely unaware that the real danger was already wrapped tightly around his throat. I watched him hyperventilate, adjusting his cuffs in a futile attempt to regain his dignity. He truly thought the public execution was over. He believed the worst damage had been inflicted and that he could simply sue his way back to the top of the hierarchy. He was remarkably wrong. The confetti and the trust fund were merely the opening acts of this theatrical production. They were designed to shatter his ego and expose his vulnerabilities to the exact audience he needed to impress. Now that he was bleeding in front of the sharks, it was time to end the charade permanently. I slipped the cream-colored document back into my tote bag. I looked out at the nervous faces of the institutional lenders and prepared to unleash the corporate guillotine. The courtyard remained trapped in a suffocating stillness. My father continued his frantic tirade, waving his arms in the crisp autumn air. He threatened to call his wealth management team. He promised to lock every gate and freeze every ledger. He operated under the fatal misconception that yelling louder would magically alter reality. I let him expend his energy. I watched his chest heave and his face turn a mottled shade of red. He was an aging monarch swinging a broken sword at a ghost. The pastel floral arrangements and elegant catering displays stood in stark contrast to his unhinged behavior. The scent of roasted lamb and expensive caviar lingered in the breeze, entirely ignored by the captivated audience. When he finally paused to draw a ragged breath, the silence on the patio returned. The wealthy guests held their collective breath, waiting for my counterattack. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head toward the edge of the terrace and offered a subtle gesture to the tall man in the charcoal suit standing near the string quartet. My family had assumed this man was my romantic partner. Vanessa had spent the first hour of the shower casting judgmental glances in his direction, whispering to her friends about my supposed desperation to secure a father figure for my unborn twins. She thought he was a quiet, passive boyfriend brought along for moral support. Julian had even offered the man a condescending smirk near the valet stand, assuming anyone associating with me must be a social inferior. They were profoundly mistaken. The man stepped forward, walking with the measured, predatory stride of a seasoned corporate litigator. He bypassed the gift table and came to stand directly beside me. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing a sleek leather portfolio tucked under his left arm. His presence immediately altered the atmospheric pressure on the lawn. He radiated a cold, clinical competence that made the surrounding country club attendees instinctively step back. "Dad Julian," I said, my tone even and conversational. "I would like to formally introduce you to Benjamin Cross. He is not my date. He is the lead acquisitions attorney for a specific private equity firm headquartered in the Midwest." My father stared at Benjamin, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The sudden pivot from family inheritance to corporate legal representation disrupted his momentum. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing as his brain struggled to connect the disparate pieces of information. The mention of the Midwest triggered a faint flicker of recognition in his gaze, but his monumental ego prevented him from grasping the truth. "I am not sure what kind of theatrical stunt you are trying to pull here, Calliope," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with renewed disdain. "Bringing a cheap Midwestern lawyer to a private family event will not change the probate laws. You are trespassing on my patience. We are done playing these childish games." I smiled a cold, brief expression. "He is not here to discuss Grandfather Harrison or the trust fund Dad. That particular transaction is finalized and out of your hands. Benjamin is here to discuss commercial real estate. Specific, we need to review the outstanding high-risk liabilities currently suffocating Tazanna developments." The mention of the family company sent a visible tremor through Julian. My older brother shifted his weight uneasily, his gaze darting between Benjamin and the institutional lenders hovering nearby. The silver-haired bankers who had been listening to my father boast just moments ago stepped closer, their financial instincts piqued by the sudden mention of commercial liabilities. The social dynamics of the baby shower evaporated instantly, replaced by the ruthless calculus of high finance. I turned my attention to the investors. Earlier this afternoon, I heard my father describing the firm holding his primary debt as a group of faceless spreadsheet pushers. He claimed they lacked vision. He assured you all that he was flying to Chicago next week to intimidate their managing partner into offering a generous restructuring plan. He promised he would secure an extended grace period by the end of a single lunch meeting. I shifted my focus back to my father, watching the color drain from his face for the second time in 10 minutes. His confident posture began to crumble. "You can cancel your flight, Dad," I told him. "Vanguard Horizon does not take in-person meetings with delinquent borrowers. We handle all asset liquidations directly through our legal department." The name of the Chicago firm dropped like an anvil onto the marble patio. Vanguard Horizon. The words seemed to echo against the stone walls of the estate. My father stumbled backward half a step, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the fallen pink confetti. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His mind finally grasped the catastrophic reality hovering right in front of him. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a picture of total, inescapable ruin. "I am the founder and sole managing partner of Vanguard Horizon," I stated, my voice ringing with crystalline authority. "I own the holding entities. I sign the acquisition orders. And as of last Tuesday, my firm quietly purchased the entirety of your toxic commercial debt from your regional banking partners. We bought the paper at a steep discount because the market knows your waterfront condominium project is a paralyzed, unmitigated disaster." Julian let out a sharp, strangled gasp. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. His hands began to shake. He reached into his tailored slacks and frantically pulled out his mobile phone. His thumbs flew across the illuminated screen, scrolling desperately through his archived corporate emails. He was searching for the entitled messages he had sent to the Chicago firm, demanding premium treatment and refusing standard financial audits. He was realizing in real time that he had been dictating his own surrender to the sister he had spent his entire life mocking. "You, Julian," I said, turning to face my brother. "You sent my risk assessment team an email last week. You claimed the Tazanna brand was prestigious enough to bypass due diligence. You told my underwriters that your internal projections spoke for themselves." Julian stared at his phone screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, sickening recognition. Next to him, Vanessa pressed a hand to her mouth. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the ground. She realized in an instant that she was married to a man who possessed no wealth, no power, and no future. We reviewed those internal projections. Julia and I continued stripping away his final layer of dignity in front of his peers. We saw the country club initiation fees categorized as marketing expenses. We saw the luxury vehicle leases and the fraudulent interior design consultations. We saw the staggering incompetence you brought to the executive suite. You breached 6 separate financial covenants hidden deep within the original loan agreements. I nodded to Benjamin. The attorney stepped forward, opening his leather portfolio. He extracted a thick stack of legal notices, printed on heavy corporate letterhead. He did not hand them to my father. He turned and presented the documents directly to the lead banker standing in the crowd, ensuring the witnesses saw the official execution. Because of gross managerial negligence and explicit covenant breaches, Vanguard Horizon is officially calling in the debt, Benjamin announced, his voice carrying the sterile, chilling weight of a corporate guillotine. Payment is demanded in full, immediately. There will be no restructuring. There will be no grace period. The twin boulders of the secret inheritance and the corporate takeover crashed together, creating a spectacular, inescapable trap. My father was pinned beneath the wreckage of his own hubris. He did not just lose control of a $5 million trust fund. He had just lost his entire commercial empire to the daughter he considered worthless. Richard looked out at the crowd of investors. The men he had spent the last 3 hours courting were now physically turning their backs on him. They were signaling their assistance, pulling out their own phones, drafting urgent messages to cut all ties with Tazanna developments. The bankers smelled the impending bankruptcy, and they were fleeing the sinking ship. My father was a king without a kingdom, standing in a shower of pink paper, stripped of his wealth, his leverage, and his public mask. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The illusion of his supreme command had turned to dust. He had nothing left to negotiate with. He possessed no hidden assets to leverage. He was financially and socially ruined. Yet even in the face of total annihilation, the narcissistic ego is a stubborn, resilient entity. Deprived of his corporate power, my father regressed to his most basic territorial instincts. He looked around the sweeping glass walls and manicured terraces of the beautiful estate where we stood. He decided, if he could not control the money, he would reassert his dominance over the physical space. He prepared to make one final, desperate mistake. The immediate aftermath of Benjamin delivering the financial death blow resembled the chaotic deck of a sinking ship. Institutional lenders possessing decades of ruthless Wall Street experience possess an uncanny ability to smell true insolvency. They did not linger to offer polite condolences or feign support. The silver-haired banking executive who had questioned the patriarch earlier simply pivoted on his expensive leather heel. He retrieved a sleek smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket, dialing his risk management department with frantic urgency. I watched his lips move, formulating swift commands to sever all fiscal ties with the tainted brand. Other financiers mirrored his exact movements. They sidestepped the fallen pink confetti, treating the space surrounding the ruined executive as a hazardous quarantine zone. The delicate social ecosystem of Connecticut high society relies entirely on proximity to influence. The man standing on the balcony had just been exposed as a hollow, penniless fraud. Nobody wanted the stench of his bankruptcy clinging to their own pristine portfolios. Vanessa observed the fleeing creditors with wide, terrified eyes. She had constructed her entire superficial identity upon the firm belief that marrying my older sibling guaranteed a lifetime of effortless luxury. Growing up on the less affluent fringes of Greenwich, she had spent her 20s strategically attending charity galas and exclusive tennis tournaments, hunting for a wealthy heir. She secured her prize, believing she had won the ultimate lottery. Now, that winning ticket had spontaneously combusted. The pristine, elegant facade she maintained so carefully finally shattered. She whirled around to face her husband, her manicured hands trembling with unadulterated rage. "You idiot!" she shrieked, her shrill voice slicing through the hushed murmurs of the departing attendees. "You lost it all. Every single dime. What did you do?" My sibling shrank away from her, unable to formulate a coherent sentence. He stared blankly at his mobile device, still displaying the damning electronic messages he had sent to my firm. He possessed no charming excuses, no patriarch to bail him out, and no hidden capital to shield him from his spouse's escalating fury. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely unequipped for the harsh reality of severe consequence. The disgraced patriarch could not process the multi-layered devastation unfolding around him. Stripped of his corporate authority and publicly humiliated by his exiled offspring, his brain scrambled to find a single thread of dominance to cling to. The narcissistic ego, when cornered, often resorts to absurd territorial claims to soothe its fatal wounds. He looked around the sweeping glass walls and manicured terraces of the lush property. He remembered the arrogant text message he had sent me, assuming I was drowning in consumer debt to afford this extravagant rental. He decided if he could not command the boardroom, he would assert total command over the physical space. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest in a desperate, hollow imitation of his former glory. "You have made your little presentation, Calliope," he snarled, his tone dripping with venom. "You ruined a private family celebration to show off your Midwestern lawyer." I am not listening to another word of this nonsense. Pack your bags and get out. I tilted my head, studying the aging tyrant who had tormented me for 3 decades. He genuinely believed he retained the sovereign authority to banish me. He thought his patriarchal status granted him supreme ownership over any room he occupied. I am not going anywhere, I replied, keeping my vocal register smooth and conversational. He pointed a shaking finger toward the iron gates visible down the long, winding driveway. This is my event, he barked. I am the head of this family. I will not allow you to disrespect me in front of my guests. You rented this venue to play a silly game, but the game is over. Leave the premises immediately before I have the event coordinator throw you out. I did not laugh. Laughter would have broken the cold, sterile tension vibrating across the lawn. Instead, I walked slowly toward the edge of the sprawling patio. I extended my hand, gently tracing the intricate veins of the imported marble column supporting the balcony. The stone felt cool and solid beneath my fingertips, serving as a tangible manifestation of the empire I had built in the shadows. I looked back at the ruined man, allowing a trace of genuine, profound pity to soften my features. I did not rent this house. Dad, I said my words carrying clearly across the silent terrace. I bought it 3 years ago, paid in cash. You are trespassing. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. He swayed on his feet, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the ocean. He looked from the pristine marble columns to the sweeping glass architecture, calculating the staggering multi-million-dollar purchase price of the real estate. The final supporting pillar of his superiority complex dissolved into dust. He was a bankrupt, disgraced executive, standing in the backyard of his billionaire daughter, ordering her to vacate her own sanctuary. I signaled toward the perimeter of the courtyard. 4 professionals wearing subtle black suits and discreet earpieces stepped out from the shadows of the manicured hedges. My private protection detail had remained invisible throughout the afternoon, waiting patiently for my explicit command. Escort these 2 men off my property, I instructed, pointing directly at the defeated duo. If they resist, involve local law enforcement. The security specialists moved with swift, unyielding efficiency. They flanked the older men, their broad shoulders creating an impenetrable physical barrier. Sir, it is time to depart, the lead guard stated, placing a firm, heavy hand on the patriarch's arm. Do not touch me, the older man hissed, trying to shake off the grip. But the guard did not flinch. The cold, physical reality of the eviction overpowered his hollow bluster. My sibling did not fight back at all. He simply hung his head, his shoulders slumping in total defeat as the guards guided him toward the front driveway. Vanessa faced a brutal, agonizing choice. Following her spouse meant tying herself to a sinking anchor destined to drag her into a life of debt collection calls and downsized living arrangements. Staying meant enduring the humiliating stares of her peers, but it offered a tiny sliver of distance from the impending financial apocalypse. She chose self-preservation. She stood paralyzed near the gift table, staring blankly at the cheap fleece blanket she had brought, attempting to calculate how quickly she could retain a divorce attorney before the bankruptcy filings became public knowledge. The crunch of expensive leather shoes on the gravel driveway served as the soundtrack to their ultimate downfall. The attendees retrieved their mobile devices, abandoning all pretense of polite decorum. Fingers flew across digital keyboards, sending rapid-fire text messages to spouses, business partners, and rival executives. Within hours, the entire Eastern Seaboard financial sector would know the precise details of the collapse. The myth of the unbreakable dynasty was dead, replaced by the thrilling, scandalous reality of a daughter dismantling her oppressors with surgical precision. I stood on the terrace, watching their dark luxury vehicles disappear down the winding wooded path. The heavy iron gates swung shut, sealing them out of my world forever. The toxic elements had been excised. I turned back to face the courtyard. A few dozen individuals remained, primarily the wives and socialites who were too shocked to move. The string quartet, uncertain of protocol, sat frozen with their bows hovering over their wooden instruments. "Please," I said, offering a warm, genuine smile to the remaining crowd. "The disruptive elements have been handled. Let us resume the afternoon." I signaled the catering director. The waiters quickly cleared the broken glass and brought out fresh trays of exquisite hors d'oeuvres. The musicians cautiously began playing a light classical piece, filling the silence with elegant melodies. I walked over to the beverage station, picked up a fresh glass of sparkling water, garnished with a twist of lime, and took a refreshing sip. I was perfectly unbothered. My pulse remained steady. My unborn daughters fluttered gently in my stomach, safe and secure within the fortress I had built for them. But I knew men raised with endless entitlement do not accept defeat gracefully. Deprived of their wealth and their territory, they inevitably resort to the only weapon they have left. They try to destroy your reputation. The public execution was finished, but the silent subterranean war was just about to begin. The 7 days following the baby shower unfolded in a state of profound, eerie quiet inside my Chicago penthouse. I returned to the Midwest, leaving the shattered remnants of my father's ego scattered across the Connecticut patio. I resumed my duties at Vanguard Horizon, reviewing acquisition targets and preparing for the arrival of my daughters. My pulse remained steady. My environment was controlled. But 1,000 miles away on the eastern seaboard, a frantic, desperate storm was brewing. Men who build their entire identities upon the perception of power do not possess the psychological capacity to process public defeat. My father could not simply admit he had been outmaneuvered by the daughter he had spent a lifetime diminishing. Accepting that reality would shatter his fragile worldview. Instead, his survival instincts demanded that he rewrite history. He needed to construct a new narrative where he remained the benevolent victim and I became the deranged villain. He launched a calculated reputational smear campaign, leveraging the only arena he still partially understood, the Fairfield Country Club. Richard positioned himself at the mahogany bar of the clubhouse, buying rounds of premium scotch for any remaining associates willing to listen to his fictions. He crafted a compelling tragic tale. He told the local real estate brokers and aging politicians that my solo pregnancy had triggered a severe hormonal imbalance. He suggested with a localized tone of fake paternal grief that the stress of impending motherhood had caused a psychotic break. The trust fund documents he claimed were crude forgeries printed at a local copy center. The sophisticated lawyer I had introduced was merely a hired actor paid to intimidate the guests. Vanguard Horizon, according to his new mythology, was nothing more than a hollow shell company, an elaborate hoax I had invented to extort my own family. He painted a picture of a desperate, unstable woman lashing out at the patriarch who had graciously tried to welcome her back into high society. In closed social circles, a convenient lie is often much easier to swallow than a disruptive truth. The extended Tazanna clan eagerly adopted his narrative. My aunts, uncles, and distant cousins relied on the illusion of my father's wealth to maintain their own precarious social standings. Acknowledging his impending bankruptcy meant acknowledging their own irrelevance. They became his willing foot soldiers, his flying monkeys dispatched to pressure the rogue element back into submission. My personal mobile phone became a battleground. Text messages flooded my screen in relentless waves. Aunt Miriam, a woman who had not bothered to call me on my birthday in a decade, sent a barrage of digital reprimands. She told me I was breaking my father's heart. She suggested I seek immediate psychiatric evaluation. She insisted that if I simply drove back to Greenwich, issued a tearful public apology, and surrendered whatever silly paperwork I held, Richard would generously forgive my embarrassing outburst. Other relatives chimed in, echoing the same toxic sentiments. They demanded I be reasonable. They commanded me to remember my place in the hierarchy. They expected the familiar dynamic to assert itself, where the collective pressure of the family unit forces the scapegoat to absorb the blame and restore the artificial peace. I did not read most of the messages. I sat at my glass dining table watching the winter winds whip across Lake Michigan, reviewing the digital onslaught with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an ant colony. The desperation reached its peak on a Thursday evening. I was finalizing a quarterly earnings report for my investors when a voicemail notification appeared on my screen. The caller ID displayed my father's private office line. I tapped the icon and placed the phone on the polished table, letting the audio fill the quiet room. The recording captured a man whose psyche was fracturing in real time. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," his voice boomed through the speaker, raw and trembling with unrestrained fury. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my primary lenders and just walk away? I am going to destroy you. I am retaining the most vicious litigators in the tri-state area. I will tie your fake little firm up in so much corporate red tape, you will be drowning in legal fees until you are 90. I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot even secure a car loan." Then the audio clipped. I heard him take a sharp, ragged breath. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted so drastically, it induced whiplash. The rage vanished, replaced by a cloying, sickeningly sweet warmth that made my skin crawl. "Callie, sweetheart," he murmured, utilizing a childhood nickname he had not used since I was 7 years old. "We do not need to do this. Your brother is incredibly stressed right now, and Vanessa is a wreck. Let us just keep this in the family. Come home this weekend. We can sit down in the study, have a cup of coffee, and figure out a sensible arrangement. You are a smart girl. You know I just want what is best for my grandchildren. Call me back immediately." The voicemail ended with a sterile electronic beep. It was a masterful display of narcissistic pathology. The rapid oscillation between severe threats and saccharine manipulation was designed to keep the target off balance. He wanted to spark a reaction. He needed me to call him back screaming in defense or crying in submission. Either response would provide him with the emotional fuel he required to validate his existence. He needed a sparring partner to prove he was still in the fight. I chose to utilize the most terrifying weapon in my entire arsenal: absolute silence. I did not return the phone call. I did not engage in digital warfare with Aunt Miriam or the rest of the flying monkeys. I blocked every single phone number associated with the Connecticut area code. I deactivated my sparse social media profiles, erasing my digital footprint. I erected an impenetrable wall of no contact. When dealing with individuals who thrive on conflict, the urge to defend your character is overwhelming. You want to present the facts. You want to scream the truth until they are forced to acknowledge reality. But engaging with a smear campaign is a losing proposition. It validates their premise that there is a debate to be had. By removing myself entirely from the equation, I starved them of their primary resource. My silence sent a chilling message. It communicated that they were no longer relevant enough to warrant a response. Any necessary communication regarding the defaulted commercial loans was routed strictly through Vanguard Horizon corporate channels. Benjamin Cross and his team of associates handled the sterile daily logistics of initiating the asset seizure protocols. They responded to Julian's frantic pleading emails with automated boilerplate legal templates, further emphasizing the cold, mechanical reality of the situation. We treated Tazanna Developments not as a family legacy, but as a delinquent account undergoing standard liquidation. The silence began to drive my father insane. The void I created acted as an agonizing echo chamber for his own insecurities. He was suffocating in the absence of my reaction. He paced the halls of his Greenwich mansion surrounded by ringing phones from angry creditors, unable to force his daughter into a screaming match. His country club associates were slowly distancing themselves, recognizing that a man who complains incessantly about a supposedly fake company while simultaneously losing his real estate assets is likely hiding a staggering financial hemorrhage. Richard needed a victory. His wounded pride, he convinced himself that the legal system would recognize his inherent superiority and validate his delusions. Driven by a potent cocktail of desperation and unchecked ego, he instructed his remaining attorneys to draft a formal complaint. He decided to force a confrontation on the public record. He assumed the threat of a courtroom battle would finally break my resolve and bring me crawling back to the negotiating table. He had no idea he was walking blindly into a trap that had been set half a decade ago. He was about to initiate a legal battle against a ghost, realizing too late that the ghost had kept all the receipts. The summons was on its way, and the final nail in his coffin was ready to be hammered home. The process server arrived at my downtown corporate headquarters on a dreary Tuesday morning. He handed the receptionist a thick stack of bound legal documents bearing the official seal of the Connecticut Superior Court. My father had executed his final desperate maneuver. He filed a formal civil complaint attempting to shatter Grandfather Harrison's irrevocable trust. The filings alleged that the patriarch suffered from advanced dementia during his final years and that I had exerted undue influence over a frail, vulnerable man to steal the inheritance. Richard operated under a very specific East Coast corporate philosophy. He believed litigation was a weapon of attrition. Throughout his tenure at Tazanna Developments, he routinely sued subcontractors, municipal planners, and rival developers simply because he could afford to keep them tied up in depositions until they ran out of capital and surrendered. He assumed the same tactic would work against me. He liquidated his last remaining personal assets, draining his private retirement accounts to retain a team of ruthless, high-priced litigators. He was betting his literal survival on the assumption that I would fold under the immense pressure of a protracted courtroom battle. He still thought I was the frightened 20-year-old girl he could bully into submission. We did not proceed to a judge immediately. Standard probate disputes require an initial attempt at alternative dispute resolution. The battleground was a sterile, heavily air-conditioned mediation suite located on the 45th floor of a neutral Boston law firm. The room smelled of ozone, expensive floor wax, and stale coffee. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the space, dividing the opposing factions like a polished wooden border wall. My father and Julian sat on the far side, flanked by 3 sharp-suited attorneys who looked like they billed thousands of dollars per hour. Richard wore a charcoal pinstripe suit, but the fabric hung loosely on his frame. The stress of the impending commercial foreclosure had aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. Julian looked even worse. My older sibling bounced his knee nervously beneath the table, his eyes darting around the room, betraying a profound lack of confidence. They were drowning men grasping at a razor-sharp legal lifeline. I sat directly across from them, radiating serene, unbothered calm. I did not bring a sprawling legal team. I only brought one man, Sterling Pierce. Sterling had spent 40 years serving as the chief legal architect for Grandfather Harrison. He was a veteran of countless hostile takeovers and ruthless boardroom purges. He possessed the quiet, lethal stillness of a predator, waiting for its prey to step blindly into a snare. He sat beside me, arranging his files with meticulous precision, his silver-framed spectacles catching the fluorescent overhead lights. The appointed mediator, a retired appellate court justice, invited the plaintiffs to present their opening argument. The lead attorney for my father stood up, adjusting his silk tie. He launched into a theatrical, impassioned monologue designed to paint a tragic picture. He described Harrison as a legendary titan of industry whose brilliant mind had tragically deteriorated in his twilight years. The hired litigator wove a fictional tale of cognitive decline. He claimed the patriarch could barely recognize his own relatives during his final months. He painted me as an opportunistic manipulator who swooped into the Berkshire estate during a moment of profound weakness, coercing a confused billionaire into signing a complex financial instrument he did not understand. It is a clear-cut case of elder abuse, the lawyer declared, his voice ringing with manufactured righteous indignation. We possess sworn affidavits from Richard and Julian testifying to the decedent's severe mental confusion. The trust is a fraudulent construct designed to bypass the rightful executors of the estate. We demand immediate nullification of the document and a full return of all diverted capital to Tazanna Developments." Julian stopped bouncing his knee. A smug, triumphant smirk crept onto his face. He looked across the mahogany divide, believing their high-priced rhetoric had successfully cornered me. My father leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms, projecting a fleeting illusion of restored authority. They thought their expensive lies could rewrite reality. I did not react to the slander. I simply turned my head slightly, acknowledging my counsel. Sterling Pierce did not stand up. He did not raise his voice or engage in performative courtroom theatrics. He merely reached out with a manicured hand and placed a heavy, thick leather folder onto the smooth, wooden surface. With a slow, deliberate motion, Sterling pushed the leather folder across the center of the mahogany conference table. It slid with a soft, definitive hiss, stopping precisely in front of the opposing lead counsel. Sterling offered the opposing team a chilling, predatory smile. That folder contains the certified medical records for Harrison Tazanna, covering the final 36 months of his life. Sterling stated, his tone clinical and devastating. "You will find monthly neurological evaluations conducted by the Chief of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. The final assessment was completed 3 days prior to the execution of the trust." The opposing attorney opened the folder, his confident posture stiffening. "As you can read," Sterling continued, leaning forward slightly, "the decedent scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. He possessed 0 markers for dementia, 0 indicators of Alzheimer's, and no pharmaceutical prescriptions that would alter his mental state. The attending physician noted that Harrison retained a sharper analytical capacity than most men half his age. Your medical claims are factually baseless." The air in the mediation suite grew thin. The smug expression vanished from Julian's face, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. Richard gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning stark white. Their entire legal foundation, built upon the premise of a frail, confused old man, was crumbling before their eyes. But Sterling was not finished. A brilliant legal tactician never relies on a single defense when they can deploy an overwhelming offensive strike. Furthermore, Sterling said, tapping a slim black remote control resting near his legal pad. Harrison anticipated this exact pathetic maneuver. He knew his son would attempt to litigate his way out of a deliberate disinheritance. Therefore, we prepared a supplementary exhibit. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall flared to life. The high-definition video displayed a familiar, austere setting. It was the library of the Berkshire estate. Sitting behind an imposing oak desk looking directly into the camera lens was Grandfather Harrison. The sight of the deceased patriarch elicited a sharp, audible gasp from my father. Harrison wore a crisp, tailored suit. His physical frame appeared frail, but his eyes burned with that familiar, terrifying intensity. He spoke clearly, his raspy voice filling the quiet mediation suite, commanding the room from beyond the grave. "I am recording this statement specifically because my son Richard is a predictable creature," Harrison announced through the speakers. "If you are watching this video, he has initiated a frivolous lawsuit claiming I lacked the mental capacity to execute my own estate planning. Let the record show I am of sound mind and pristine memory." My father shrank downward, his posture collapsing under the spectral gaze of the man he had spent his life trying to emulate. "I diverted $5 million into a blind trust for Calliope because she is the only member of this family who possesses actual business acumen." Harrison continued his words, striking like physical blows. "Richard is a profound disappointment. He manages capital with the discipline of a degenerate gambler. Julian is even worse. They will undoubtedly drive Tazanna Developments into insolvency within a decade of my passing. I refuse to let them burn my entire legacy to the ground. The trust stands. Any attempt to contest it is merely the final, flailing effort of an incompetent executive refusing to accept his own failures." The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The high-priced litigators seated next to my father exchanged grim, knowing glances. They recognized a dead end when they saw one. The medical records proved cognitive health. The video deposition destroyed any theory of undue influence. The lawsuit was dead on arrival. Richard stared at the blank monitor, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. He had wagered his last remaining dollars on this legal gamble, expecting to terrorize me into submission. Instead, he had been forced to sit in a quiet room and listen to his idol declare him a catastrophic failure on the permanent legal record. The mediator cleared his throat, closing his notepad. "I believe we are finished here," he murmured, recognizing the total destruction of the plaintiff's case. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket. The trust fund was secure. The frivolous litigation was crushed. But the comprehensive dismantling of the Tazanna patriarchy required one final critical step. The commercial debt I held through Vanguard Horizon was still ticking like a financial time bomb waiting for detonation. I looked down at the ruined, trembling men sitting across the table. They possessed no leverage, no capital, and no legal recourse. They were trapped. It was time to transition from the mediation suite directly into the boardroom and demand their unconditional surrender. The retired judge closed his leather notebook and excused himself from the room. The mediation regarding my grandfather and his final wishes had concluded. The opposing legal counsel began packing their briefcases, eager to escape the suffocating tension of a defeated campaign. My father placed his hands on the armrests of his chair, preparing to stand. He looked exhausted, ready to retreat to Connecticut and lick his wounds. I raised a single hand, keeping my palm flat against the smooth mahogany table. "Do not stand up, Dad," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority. "The probate matter is officially closed. However, we have not yet addressed your corporate liabilities." Richard froze. He slowly lowered himself back into the seat, his posture rigid with sudden apprehension. Julian stopped wiping the nervous sweat from his forehead. Both men stared across the polished wooden divide, realizing the tactical nightmare was far from over. Sterling Pierce reached into his sleek black briefcase for a second time. He did not extract the cream parchment associated with estate planning. He pulled out a fresh stack of thick, stapled contracts bearing the stark, modern letterhead of Vanguard Horizon. He slid the heavy documents to the center of the table. "Let us discuss the current fiscal health of Tazanna developments," I suggested, leaning forward slightly. "My risk assessment team audited your revised ledgers this morning. You are exactly 14 days away from defaulting on your payroll obligations. The regional banks have already filed preliminary injunctions regarding the stalled waterfront project. Your subcontractors are preparing to place permanent liens on your remaining commercial properties. You have 0 runway left." Richard swallowed hard. His expensive litigators stopped packing their bags, recognizing a high-stakes corporate negotiation unfolding in real time. "My firm is prepared to offer a comprehensive restructuring package," I continued, maintaining a clinical, detached cadence. "Vanguard Horizon will assume the remaining outstanding liabilities. We will inject immediate operational liquidity to satisfy the municipal fines and pay your stranded construction crews. We will halt the asset seizure protocols and save the Tazanna brand from a highly public, humiliating bankruptcy." A fleeting, desperate spark of hope ignited in my father's hollow eyes. He looked at me, fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the transaction. He still viewed me through the distorted lens of his own ego. He assumed the dutiful daughter had finally returned to rescue the struggling patriarch, desperate for his ultimate approval. "That is a very sensible approach, Calliope," Richard murmured, attempting to inject a tone of collaborative warmth into his gravelly voice. "If we consolidate the loans under your umbrella, Julian and I can streamline the development pipeline. We can allocate a board seat for your firm, giving you a voice in the upcoming residential acquisitions." I did not smile. The temperature in the mediation suite seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You are not grasping your current position," I replied, my tone silencing his pathetic attempt at negotiation. This is not a partnership. This is a hostile takeover. Vanguard Horizon will rescue the enterprise, but the cost is total capitulation. I pointed to the primary contract resting on the table. In exchange for the capital injection, you will step down as Chief Executive Officer, effective at the close of business today. Julian will resign his Vice President title immediately. Both of you will surrender 100% of your voting shares to my holding company. Julian let out a sharp, strangled gasp. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He had never applied for a job in his entire life. He coasted from an elite fraternity house directly into a corner office, shielded by nepotism and blind parental devotion. The prospect of navigating the real world without a prestigious title or a corporate credit card terrified him. "You cannot do this to us," Julian stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of reality. "We built that brand. It is our legacy. You are trying to steal our entire future over a temporary cash flow problem. You squandered your future the day you decided treating a commercial real estate firm like a personal slush fund was a sustainable business model," I countered, slicing through his hollow defense. "I am simply cleaning up the wreckage." I turned my attention back to the patriarch. The terms are non-negotiable. You will possess 0 equity, 0 boardroom authority, and 0 access to the corporate treasury. Furthermore, both of you will sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. You will be legally prohibited from discussing the details of your ouster with the press, the country club, or any of your former associates. If you violate the gag order, Vanguard Horizon will sue you into permanent poverty. Richard exploded. The sheer audacity of the ultimatum shattered his fragile composure. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany surface, rattling the empty water glasses. He refused to hand the keys of his kingdom to a firm located halfway across the country. He swore he would rather file Chapter 11 bankruptcy than surrender his life's work to an ungrateful, vindictive child. I sat perfectly still, allowing his temper tantrum to echo against the glass walls. When his breathing grew ragged, I delivered the final, inescapable truth. "Filing Chapter 11 means opening your ledgers to a federal judge," I reminded him quietly. "A federal auditor will scrutinize every single transaction. They will uncover the fraudulent interior design consultations. They will find the phantom luxury vehicle leases. They will trace the diverted corporate funds you used to maintain your personal mansion. Bankruptcy does not just mean losing your company, Dad. It means facing federal fraud indictments." The fight drained out of his posture in a matter of seconds. The stark, chilling threat of a prison sentence overrode his towering ego. His high-priced attorneys looked away, offering no counter-arguments, silently confirming the catastrophic legal peril he faced. I offered one final concession, a deliberate maneuver designed to strip away his last shred of dignity. "Vanguard Horizon will provide a modest, fixed pension," I stated, sliding a pen toward him. "The monthly stipend will cover your basic living expenses and a quiet, downsized apartment. It will not cover your Greenwich estate or your golf club memberships. You will retain a meaningless figurehead title on paper, strictly for public optics, but you are permanently banned from stepping foot inside any building bearing our last name." Julian broke. The golden child, the protected heir, stared at the stark black ink on the surrender documents. His wife was already consulting divorce attorneys. His bank accounts were drained. The inheritance he had lorded over me for decades was a mirage. He lowered his face into his hands. His shoulders shook as he wept silently, mourning the unearned destiny he had destroyed through his own staggering incompetence. Richard picked up the heavy silver pen. His hand trembled uncontrollably. For decades, his signature had commanded millions of dollars, dictated the fates of countless employees, and fueled his own supreme narcissism. Now, his signature was the instrument of his own professional execution. He signed the papers. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the sterile suite, aside from my brother's muffled, pathetic sobs. Richard initialed every page, legally transferring his entire empire to the daughter he had told to expect nothing. He slid the finalized contracts across the smooth wooden divide. I did not offer a triumphant smirk. I did not deliver a final, gloating monologue to rub salt in his fresh wounds. True power does not require theatrical validation. I simply gathered the paperwork, verified the required signatures, and handed the heavy portfolio to Sterling Pierce. The transaction was complete. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. My father looked up at me, his eyes hollow and pleading. He was begging for a final scrap of familial connection, a single word of closure, or a tiny sliver of forgiveness to soothe his devastated psyche. I offered nothing. The toxic cycle was broken. I turned my back on the two ruined men. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out of the room, letting it click shut behind me. I did not look back. The severance was total, paving the way for a brand new era. 6 months passed. The harsh Connecticut winter melted into a vibrant, blooming spring. I sat on the sweeping stone terrace of my estate, the exact location where the pink confetti had rained down and destroyed a patriarchal illusion. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and fresh rain. The sprawling courtyard was empty of catering staff, string quartets, and nervous institutional investors. The space belonged entirely to me, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of the ancient oak trees and the soft, rhythmic breathing of my two healthy infant daughters resting in their twin bassinet. Motherhood arrived with a profound, clarifying stillness. I spent my days learning the subtle nuances of their cries, marveling at the strength in their tiny gripping fingers, and building a routine insulated from the toxic demands of my former relatives. I did not hire a fleet of nannies to raise them while I attended country club luncheons. I managed my corporate empire from a home office overlooking the gardens, ensuring my girls would grow up witnessing a woman who held power without sacrificing her own soul to keep it. A cool breeze swept across the patio. I reached into the woven nursery basket beside my chair and pulled out a simple, thin fleece blanket. It was the exact generic item my former sister-in-law, Vanessa, had handed me during the shower. At the time, she intended the discount store purchase to serve as a petty, calculated insult, a stark contrast to the silver rattles and imported cashmere sweaters piled high on the gift tables. I draped the soft fabric over my sleeping daughters, tucking the edges securely around their small shoulders. The irony was exquisite. The expensive designer offerings gifted by the terrified bankers had proven entirely impractical. Cashmere required special dry cleaning. The silver rattles were heavy and cold. Vanessa's cheap, spiteful gift turned out to be the most functional, durable, and genuinely warm item in the nursery. It washed easily. It held the heat perfectly. My girls slept soundly beneath it, entirely unaware of the bitter intentions woven into its synthetic threads. They transformed a weapon of passive condescension into a shield of genuine comfort. While my daughters slept, the corporate entity that once bore my family name underwent a radical, necessary evolution. Tazanna Developments was no longer a personal slush fund for entitled men. Following the hostile takeover in the Boston mediation suite, I immediately initiated a total structural purge. I did not step in to run the daily operations myself. My expertise lay in acquisitions and wealth management, not municipal zoning. Instead, I conducted a rigorous nationwide executive search. I recruited a brilliant, seasoned chief executive officer from a rival firm in Manhattan. She possessed 2 decades of commercial real estate experience, a pristine track record of salvaging distressed assets, and a zero-tolerance policy for corporate nepotism. During her first week on the job, she terminated every single country club crony Julian had hired. She audited the payroll, identified the staggering gender wage gaps my father had institutionalized, and immediately corrected the discrepancies. Under her relentless leadership, the company stabilized.
The paralyzed waterfront condominium project was successfully renegotiated, properly permitted, and sold to a reputable residential developer at a sensible profit. The institutional lenders who had fled my patio 6 months prior returned to the negotiating table, eager to partner with the new, highly competent administration. The brand was saved, but the toxic culture that originally defined it was permanently eradicated. My father and my brother remained ghosts. They signed their non-disclosure agreements and accepted their mandated exiles. Vanguard Horizon issued their fixed monthly stipends on the first of every month, depositing the modest funds into their new, highly restricted checking accounts. They relocated to quiet, unassuming apartments in a neighboring state, far removed from the elite Greenwich social circles they used to dominate. The ironclad legal gag orders ensured their perpetual silence. They could not spin false narratives at the country club bar. They could not portray themselves as victims to the local press. Deprived of their wealth, their titles, and their audience, they simply faded into the mundane obscurity they had always feared. Meanwhile, the extraordinary gift from Grandfather Harrison remained untouched. The $5 million irrevocable trust sat securely within my private Vanguard accounts, quietly compounding interest day by day. I did not need to withdraw a single cent to fund my lifestyle or support my children. My own self-made fortune provided more than enough capital to sustain us. The trust served a different, higher purpose. It was a dedicated financial fortress, an unbroken promise, ensuring my daughters would never endure the financial manipulation I had survived. They would enter adulthood equipped with choices, resources, and the undeniable freedom to chart their own destinies without asking a patriarch for permission. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, letting the warm ceramic mug heat my palms. I looked out over the rolling green hills of my property, feeling a deep, resonating sense of peace. The covert war was officially over. The battlefield was cleared, and the victory was permanent. I want to speak directly to the women listening to this story right now. Perhaps you're sitting in your car during a lunch break, or walking through a quiet neighborhood, or staring at the ceiling of a cramped apartment, wondering how you will ever escape the invisible chains tying you down. Maybe you are the designated scapegoat of your family, the one whose achievements are consistently minimized, while the mediocre accomplishments of the golden child are celebrated. Maybe you are told that your ambitions are unrealistic, that your education is a vanity project, and that your ultimate value relies entirely upon the person you marry. You might be sitting at a holiday dinner table right now, swallowing your brilliant ideas because speaking up only invites a chorus of condescending laughter. I know the unique, suffocating exhaustion of that existence. I know what it feels like to be treated as a supporting character in a narrative written by men who view your independence as a personal threat. Do not waste your precious energy trying to change their minds. Do not engage in screaming matches in the hallway, and do not beg for a seat at a table where the game is inherently rigged against you. Arguing with self-absorbed individuals only provides them with the emotional friction they crave. Instead, you must weaponize your invisibility. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe their patronizing remarks are successfully keeping you in your place. While they are busy admiring their own reflections and squandering their unearned advantages, you need to retreat into the shadows and start building. Educate yourself relentlessly. Save your capital with strict discipline. Read the contracts, study the market, and learn the intricate rules of the systems designed to exclude you. Construct your own independent sanctuary, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, far away from their scrutinizing gaze. True legacy is not carried in a specific surname. It is not determined by gender, and it is not granted by a boastful patriarch holding a microphone at a lavish party. Legacy is forged in resilience. It is defined by the rigid boundaries you draw and the silent, ruling work you accomplish when no one else is watching. They will tell you that you are incapable of leading. They will insist the glass ceiling is made of impenetrable iron. They will try to convince you that the highest achievement you can hope for is a modest promotion or a fortunate marriage. Do not just break the glass ceiling.
That only leaves you with bloody knuckles and a mess to clean up on their floor. Do the silent work. Accumulate your leverage. Build your own empire in the dark. Because when the inevitable moment arrives and their fragile, mismanaged kingdoms begin to collapse under the weight of their own arrogance, you will not need to ask them for a promotion. You will just buy the building.